It's so good to see so many of you here, so thank you so much for coming. My name's Kevin Keith. I'm chair of the UK Open Government Network, but I'll say a little bit more about that a bit later on. I've spent so much of my career kind of working on issues around democracy, open government, engaging people in politics and various other things, so really looking forward to this conversation today. But I first want to introduce the panel. You know, after these lunch breaks, quite often people get to stand up and clap your hands to bring the energy back into the room. I looked at the panel and thought, no, we don't need that. Listen, we've got this panel here.
I thought you were about to make us do that.
No. We've got such an amazing panel. And I will start with Catherine, actually, who is the Deputy Director of Data and Joint Analysis Unit and Chair of the Cross-Government Participatory Methods Forum, with a background in anthropology. Some really interesting conversations after about 10 seconds of meeting Catherine already. International strategy and security. She has worked extensively on transforming how governments engage with the public to improve impact. To my right is Gavin Hayman, who's the Executive Director of the Open Contracting Partnership, which operates in 50 countries. The organisation works with governments, businesses, civil society and technologists to open up public contracting through open data, improve transparency, smarter business and civic engagement. And then Lindsay's on the far side there, is Deputy Director of Procurement Reform in the Cabinet Office and has been doing that for around 10 years. Prior to that, she had over a decade of commercial experience in sectors like property and aerospace sector, so really sort of broad, wide-ranging experience. And then we have Lord Nat Way of Shoreditch, many of whom in here will have seen him earlier, a leading voice in technology, innovation and social entrepreneurship. As a legislator, advisor and founder, he's worked to create impactful solutions to global challenges. He currently serves on the Science and Technology Select Committee in the House of Lords, shaping policy on digital transformation and emerging technology. So you're in for a real treat in terms of the panel. Now, what we'll do is we're going to start with a conversation initially around participation and how to kind of, how more people, we can involve more people in government in that sense of opening up government. We'll then move on to open contracting as a case study because we have representatives sort of from civil society and government to talk about open contracting data standard, various examples and other things. Before moving on to the future of open government, where is this all going? How fast does it need to get there? And where are we currently? But before we get into that, just I suppose my job is to kind of say, well, what is open government and why does it matter? Well, the OECD, they define open government as being a culture of governance based on the promotion of the principles around accountability, transparency, integrity, and stakeholder engagement, so as to strengthen democracy and lead to inclusive growth. The UK and the UK government, in fact, is also a member of what's called the Open Government Partnership. It's a founder member that formed over 10 years ago. There's 77 countries and 150 local governments who are also involved in that. So the UK government's involved, Scotland's involved, Glasgow and Greater Manchester Combined Authority and Northern Ireland are also all members of the Open Government Partnership. As I mentioned, I'm chair of the UK Open Government Network, which kind of is a conduit really between the Open Government Partnership and the UK government. We try and link civil society and existing networks, many of whom you'll belong to through Open UK, to the processes of working with government. Because whilst we have principles around transparency, accountability and participatory governance, it's really the kind of translation of those principles into action is where kind of open government sort of comes into its own. So every now and then, every biannually, I should say, we have, I say now and then because they're not always biannual, but they are roughly biannual. We put together a national action plan for open government. So how do we translate these principles into action? And over the decade or so that we've been involved in open government, there have been some big outcomes. I know we have, we're the first country in the G20 to have a register of beneficial ownership. I know there's a speaker from open ownership tomorrow. I mean, that's a huge area in terms of tackling corruption and illicit finance, trying to track down the original owners of an asset, usually property. And those proceeds, when you do that, then come back to the economy and can be reinvested into other public services. We're the first in G20 to adopt the open contracting data standard. Gavin will talk a bit about that later. And also kind of through working with the Open Government Partnership, we're the first in the world to develop the algorithmic transparency standard as well. So all of these kind of things have come through open government. But we also have policy commitments around aid transparency, how money is spent overseas, commitments on open data. The UK government was maybe once sort of a leader in terms of the release of open data. Hopefully we'll get back there, and various other things too. The reason why all of this matters is because, I mean, well, quite often open government is seen as a project within government, when in truth it's not. It's a culture of governance, and it should be something applicable to all governance. When we talk about kind of policrises, whether it's internationally or nationally, we tend to sort of, one of the things, we talk about environment or technology, but for me there's the crisis of trust, which is underlying so much of many of the challenges we face at the moment. The OECD found in 2023 that 44% of people had low or no trust in their government. NatCen did research last year that showed 45% of UK citizens didn't feel that any party of any particular sort of colour would put their interests above their own. And more recently, 52% of Gen Z, as a recent survey by Channel 4, said they prefer a strong leader who doesn't have to bother with elections. So you can kind of see why the issue of trust is sort of front centre, and why I feel that there's a trust crisis. Yeah, sure. That's probably better, isn't it? Yeah. So there's a kind of fundamental threat to democracy itself. And when you have these multiple crises, you can't really have a siloed response. It has to be systemic. And we'll talk a little bit more about that very soon. We need a culture of governance that's more open, participatory, and accountable. And the other thing, just to add, is that there is one of the problems is that the people don't necessarily vote for the process of government, and open government is heavily associated with the process of government. They vote for the performance of government. So we'll also talk about how to actually ensure that we talk about outcomes of various other things too. So there's that kind of dual mission, really, to talk about how to promote a culture of open government, but also demonstrate how it has a positive impact on people's lives. So the system side and the outcome side together. So let's start. Let's start with Catherine. Catherine, who is the chair of the Participatory Cross-Departmental Participatory Methods Forum. Is that right?
You make it sound so important, Kevin.
It is.
It's a slightly insurgent movement in government, which I can tell you more about. But I wanted to start by saying hello. I've been so looking forward to this conversation, because it feels to me like the thing that certainly unites all of us on this panel, and probably one way or another all of us in this room and at this event, is that I think that we're all grasping for a better way of doing government, a new sort of way of doing government, and wondering what we can bring to this. And I feel this really acutely, because government is often looked to for the answers on all of this. And the first thing that Kevin asked me to think about and talk about is why participation matters. And the main thing that I wanted to say about that is really that participation matters because of the way the world is. And because it is the way it is, it's really pointless to sit back and hope and wait for our current systems of government to deliver the answers. Because the big opportunities and challenges that we face from where I'm sitting, none of us can get after them alone. So we've got to find new and better ways of working together to bring that about. And we all have agency in this. And so if you take nothing else away from these couple of days, then I hope that this conversation can spark in you something that sends you away afterwards thinking, right, okay, look, how can I contribute here? What is my individual contribution that I can make to organising ourselves better as a society to get to the outcomes that we all want? Because I think that we think about government slightly weirdly. And I'm looking at my sort of colleagues who are part of this amazing sort of national, international, local system that we've invented for ourselves. And, you know, we've got these institutions, sure, but actually government, it's the sum total of all of our individual choices about how we organise ourselves to get after the things that we care about. And so that fundamentally is why I think participation is so important. If we want to live in a country, in a world that is sustainable, in which we're all reasonably healthy in the long term, reasonably prosperous in the long term, reasonably secure in the long term, then we all need to get stuck in and to make that happen. The institutions that we've got now, sure, they need to evolve. We do need inside government to work in more participatory ways. We do need to look ahead more. But these are some of the things that sort of we're all working on, that I'm working on in that sort of bizarre job titles, sort of chair of the Participatory Methods Forum. But we will only get so far unless there's a mechanism that we put together that enables us to keep all of us on the straight and narrow through those political cycles where things change, to keep our eye on those long-term goals. I think that we've got some great examples globally of where participatory societies and participatory governments have managed to move things on and have achieved really big change. And one of my inspirations for the Participatory Methods Forum was what South Korea as a country has achieved over the last 70 years by coming from absolute poverty to a top-class economy these days through all sorts of, and they might not have thought about it as being participatory at the time, but through a real whole-of-nation, whole-of-society effort that everybody was able to get behind. More sort of latter-day examples include the cultural change that we've seen in Ireland coming through the legislation that they brought in around citizens' assemblies and so on. That's what I wanted to say about why participation matters. I mean, Kevin, you've majored on trust, and it's a really big and important theme. And I don't know if you've read the Edelman Trust Barometer for 2025, but it's incredibly powerful and incredibly worrying, actually. Some really good food for thought in that. It shows that its headline is that people's economic fears have really just evolved, metastasized into grievance. And we've got nearly 2/3 of people who think that our institutions exist to serve the wealthy and not them. And this is something that we really need to turn around. But, trust, I kind of see as the outcome, the byproduct of actually organising ourselves well and actually doing government well. And that means participatory processes, things like, actually technology has a huge part to play in that. We can get into sort of more examples later if you want, Gavin.
This is a culture of collaboration. Many of you are involved in open source communities, and you'll be working with people you may not necessarily know, but you'll be working in communities. How many people in this room have engaged with the government in a way which feels like you're meaningfully engaging with the government on policy? Just raise your hand. Okay, so fair few.
Can I ask a counter question to that?
Yeah.
How many of you have engaged in outcomes that you would see as being collective outcomes? So things like sort of health and security and generating wealth. How interesting.
And I suppose genuinely, it's almost like we need all of the hands to go up. That's kind of the journey we're going on. We're talking about a cultural change here, not necessarily projects within government, not exemplars. And those exemplars will form part of that journey. And I know, Catherine, you're working on, sort of initiatives which will try and put this front and centre. But you could see a time maybe in 5-10 years, because the technology is there, when you talk about Taiwan or South Korea, to enable people to participate in a much more different way. Could you envisage the time in, say, 5 or 10 years, State of Open 2032, when all of the hands would go up in this room? Is that kind of...
I would love that.
Yeah.
I mean, look, you asked me to think also about how we're doing in the UK,
Yeah.
and as you say, we've got these amazing exemplars that we can work towards now, and there's fantastic inspiration from these other countries. There's also actually fantastic inspiration from our own. So, I mean, my main message on sort of how are things going here is that there's a bit of progress. It is absolutely not enough. And this is where roomfuls of people like this can play a part in accelerating and scaling that. You're really, really good at scaling, government not so much. And the biggest challenge I think that we've got to overcome here, Gavin, is this institutional inertia, and really sort of show sort of how we can do things differently and the potential in these technologies. But there are some really shining examples of doing participation well in the UK. And some of these things, have been brought in institutionally. So and a lot of really good stuff's going on actually at local level and at regional level, where you're closer to the outcomes for citizens and can get really stuck in. But Scotland, for example, has brought in legislation so that I think, is it 2% of local authority budgets have to be allocated in participatory ways? You're holding up a finger, which might mean that it's 1%.
I think, well, listen, it might be 2%, 1 or 2%.
And then there are fantastic local initiatives. I mean, people talk a lot about Camden, which is well worth a look, because they worked, really sort of seriously and deliberately with the economist Mariana Mazzucato to apply these approaches that she developed. She calls it mission thinking, but frankly, it's also all about collaboration and participation in pursuit of shared outcomes. And they sort of used Camden as a bit of a test bed for a lot of these initiatives, and it's led to some extraordinary results there. I mean, we've seen the direct impact on trust. There are all sorts of sort of ways in which, and it grew initially out of COVID. There are all sorts of new ways in which they were able to solve these really complex problems, like making sure that people had decent school meals, that actually people were fed. And it's grown over time. So they've just launched a citizens' wealth fund for the community, run by the community.
Challenges then. So we can see the potential of, and we can absolutely see the rationale for engaging people in policy making, so as to build trust and to actually achieve better policy outcomes too. But what challenges exist? What challenges exist to kind of to build that culture, that different way of governance? Yeah.
So from where I'm sitting, and you called me an anthropologist, so I do see things through this survive or die, sort of humans and how humans act or don't act, and the incentive for humans to act in certain ways. So I do see things through that sort of lens. But I would say that for me, it is all about culture. Yeah. And there are different aspects to this. So I think that there's something about government becoming more participatory, which it's really hard for, civil servants and politicians. I mean, maybe you want to talk a bit about this in a minute, to get after, because done well, a proper participatory society, proper participatory government of that society, does involve giving people, participants, a meaningful say in decisions. And that does mean, potentially giving up a bit of control. People sometimes talk about giving up power. I don't see it that way. I see it as a different sort of power, as a sort of collaborative power. And I see these as being approaches that, really strengthen the sorts of democratic systems that we've got. But that is a big cultural barrier and is something that I hear a lot about. There's something also about our institutional culture. I mean, our institutions were set up to do really important things in certain ways. And it really matters that we don't suddenly stop doing those things from day to day. But at the same time, we do have to evolve and adapt. Otherwise, we just won't be sort of fit to operate in our environment. There's the anthropologist in me coming out again. And so there's something about, yes, let's evolve our existing institutions. And that's what we're doing day to day in the Participatory Methods Forum. It's deliberately boringly named, by the way, so that we don't sort of scare anybody too much who's keeping the country running. And that forum is all about helping our institutions to understand and unlock the power that actually working in participatory ways, not just on policy. Policy is a small part of what government does. We're all about public service delivery as well, that sort of thing. So the forum is all about helping the whole of government to understand how to be more participatory, to get better outcomes for people, and to build trust as a byproduct of that. But that's only part of it. We also need to show what our institutions of the future should look like. If we were designing participatory governance from scratch and making it really tech-enabled, what would that look like? And here I think that you can help as well. So cultural challenges. I think it's also a problem, by the way, the psychology of this. We're a country that, in my experience, sits back quite a lot and thinks of itself as being really very open, really very democratic. That's just fine. And I think there's a little bit of I'm not totally convinced that we're as open as we think that we are.
I think that very neatly sort of leads into our next area. I mean, you will have all seen the post office scandal, when all of a sudden we were looking into a system which was very closed, and people were talking about procurement, as it kind of became mainstream, possibly around the pandemic as well. Procurement, people started asking, really, it happens like this? People started to look into that process around procurement, around contracting, and actually that gives life to initiatives such as open contracting. Which Gavin Hayman's the executive director. Tell us more about open contracting, and tell us more about where it came from.
Brilliant, thank you. Thank you very much for having me, Open UK and everyone else. So public procurement is where the money and power is in government, right? It's 1 in every £3 spent. So that's about £300 billion a year. So it's a third of the government's budget. And really, it should be central to economic inclusion, innovation, and it's your tax dollars at work. So it's absolutely central in terms of public trust. And if we get it wrong, like we talked about the post office scandal or thinking about the COVID VIP lane procurement, it's absolutely corrosive to public trust as well. So the Open Contracting Partnership, we're a global non-profit working in loads of different countries, but really our mission is to open up and fundamentally rethink public procurement as that kind of engine of innovation, as a user-centered digital public service, and really thinking about how it can serve the citizens rather than bureaucracy. And so we really think about it in two ways. One is that whole process of actual goal-driven reform of public procurement. How do you make it simple, accessible, and effective that we can do business and foster innovation, to talk to the market, to get the best ideas from the market, and then kind of invest in those and scale those to deliver better public services. We all know we've got the kind of climate, emergency going on. We've got huge issues with public delivery and everything else. So government is going to have to buy things in a fundamentally different way. And the second part of open contracting is then thinking about the digitalization and data that can really drive delivery. So for the first time ever, really helping governments understand who they're buying from, for how much, and what kind of outcomes they're getting for their money. And thinking that across the entire flow of planning, delivering public contracts. So perhaps the most important stage is actually not the procuring stage where you have an idea of what you want to buy. It's the stage before that's the planning. It's like, what is it we want to buy, right? What's the problem we're trying to solve versus what's the widget we're trying to buy at the cheapest price. So it's really thinking about that. And our organisation is perhaps the cheeky, non-governmental agitator trying to get governments to rethink that. And it's been really exciting kind of trying to work with the UK government and others, learn the lessons from COVID to rethink that. And one of the key tools we have, and it's not the only tool, right, because it's even more important that we have a collaborative process and we're talking to businesses and citizens and government to understand what the sticking points are, but there's something called the Open Contracting Data Standard. So it's an open source data standard, completely free for obviously anyone to use, but to unlock and share all the documents and the data around public procurement across that entire cycle to make it machine readable at scale. And that data can be the flywheel, if you like, that helps you understand what you're spending your money on, what the outcomes are, and what you should be spending your money on in future, and really thinking that through. And long story short, where we've seen that in various different countries, we've seen really radical improvements in competition, in efficiency, and indeed in public trust and public probity as well. So that's the kind of good story. Where the UK is, ever so simply, is the UK has just passed the Procurement Act from 2023. There's this really exciting stage where the team behind it, including Lindsay, have been really intentional, thinking through the data and the identifiers and other things to really structure and assemble the data set for the first time ever in the UK. So I'll stop there, but it's that process of like rethinking public procurement to be better, smarter, more digital and more effective.
Was a cute agitator? Has he been a cute agitator? So again, through open government, Gavin and Lindsay, so to civil society and government, or cheeky agitator, have been working together on, obviously, the aspects of the Procurement Act. So tell me about the Procurement Act, and then tell me about how you've been working with civil society on such a complex process.
Yes, thank you. So as Gavin said, this has been quite a long-term project. So it's actually a benefit of leaving the EU. I get in trouble if I say it's the only benefit of leaving the EU, but our regulations at the moment in the UK are built with a single market in mind. So we actually had a really good opportunity to open up that public procurement. And what we wanted to do was make it a lot more flexible. So a lot of our challenges from procurement teams around the country is that it's quite rigid. And that rigidity obviously creates problems for marketplaces to be able to respond. And obviously, the flip side of that is that if you're going to make it more flexible, you also need it to be a lot more transparent so that people can see how and why procurement teams are buying across the UK. So a lot of the work that we did with Gavin and his team on the outside, and also from international sort of collaborators such as Ukraine, which I know Gavin will probably talk about, it's a really great case study on opening up transparency data, is looking at those standards and then figuring out a way of actually legislating for that data during the procurement process. And that's quite key, because without that legislation, we're not gonna encourage all of the procurement teams across the UK to actually provide us that data. We've tried that before, and it's really patchy. And it's actually really difficult at the moment to see where money is going end to end. So what we've been able to do is we've been able to take all of that feedback, to take the open data standards and actually embed that throughout our procurement legislation, which means that from the 24th of February, if a local council is buying something, they'll have various different data things they'll have to enter into the system. Now, that hasn't been easy, and obviously I can come on to the challenges a little bit, but just from my perspective, I think as Gavin has touched on, when procurement never gets any praise when it goes right. You never hear anyone saying, oh wow, that was a brilliant procurement. But when it goes wrong, it goes really wrong, and it gets a lot of criticism, and on behalf of the government, we kind of are quite sort of forward-facing in terms of some of those crises. So the way that I look at it is that if you can open up procurement and if you can be really visible about what you're doing, there's sort of three main pillars and three kind of really key benefits to that. One is if you're publishing what you're about to buy, you get more small businesses engaged in the process. That's good for economic growth, which is really important. The second one is about using that data to get commercial outcomes. So there's a sort of a method of contracting at the moment, which is via frameworks. There are over 1,000 frameworks in the UK. Many of them are exactly the same. They're just slightly different sectors, slightly different suppliers. If you publish all of that, you can look at that and go, well, hang on a minute, why are there 1,000 things at the same, sort of delivery centre, but actually they're all different prices? And that is actually true. So if you look at it, you've got a range of different prices across the piece. Looking at that in all in one place, you then go, actually, I'm paying too much for this. I'm going to try and kind of reduce that down. And the final bit, which I think is where Gavin has really kind of helped shape our policy and helped shape the way that we look at this, is open data is all about protecting the UK supply chains from threats, so beneficial ownership, anti-corruption, red flags. If we can build all of that into sort of a unique identifier for those suppliers, if things go wrong or if there are hostile actors who are working against the UK, we're in a much better position to be able to identify where those threats are. And that was a really hard lesson learnt from when Russia invaded Ukraine, that actually, obviously, obviously ministers and taxpayers, etc., saying, well, hang on, are we spending public funds on Russian companies? And actually there was no way of really kind of identifying that. So it won't be straight away. You know, we're looking at kind of a long-term change, and there are behavioural aspects, absolutely, which Catherine has talked about in terms of how some of this thinking is institutionalised. But I think we've kind of set the building blocks to be able to deliver against essentially what Gavin has been asking for over the last few years.
Do you want to tell us more about Ukraine then as an example, do you think?
I could do. I know you're precious on time. I'm happy to draw out some lessons on, so just reflections. One, I think, just in terms of, we're just about to go live with the regime, so it will be
2 weeks and 5 days, Gavin.
Yep.
That's why I look so tired.
6 hours, and so that's really exciting. That will be the big moment where we see exactly where the UK's got to. I think some of the things are recognising having an open data standard that others had used successfully. I think that's been vital for the UK adopting things, and that kind of evidence of great transformations elsewhere, including Ukraine, which saved itself basically $1 billion a year over the years of its reforms. I think that's been really powerful. I do think there's a real value in unrecognised a team with a very clear vision inside government, who then have the capacity and bandwidth to engage people outside and make everyone more than the sum of their parts. That's been a really part of that. So if you look at the procurement reform, the Open Government Action Plan started in 2016, but there's this thread of continual collaborative work and reinforcement of trust over time that then was able to seize on the opportunity of the 2023 Procurement Act. So that's been really powerful. I think from our point of view, flexible support from our funders to pivot to support the UK when that opportunity became available was really important. And I think the opportunity of learning the lessons from COVID and other things have been very, very powerful. So just that was obviously not the UK's best moment. It's when the data and information was been vital to better procurement and wasn't used, and that lesson learned, I think, landed very hardly across government. And I think it is worth recognising there are moments of political support. Both the House of Lords, has done a great job, people speaking up on behalf across the benches about why don't we have this information? Come on, other countries do have. But I think also recognising there are moments where Lord Agnew and others, with his leadership, really helped push the thing forwards and perhaps overcome some of the blocks inside government and the data in the silos. Those seem some useful lessons. That lessons like political support meets internal capacity with a very smart team who are then able to leverage outside actors who have compelling examples and great data. That makes sense.
So we've talked about different participatory methods, ways in which citizens and government can work collaboratively on policy. And we've just had an example of civil society and government working on a specific policy. But what else? What if it happened across the board in all kinds of government, in all areas of government? Typically, open government has been heavily associated with innovation. I don't know if anyone remembers around 2014, 2015, the whole open data movement. It was about innovation and economic growth alongside trust, transparency and accountability. Now, we're going to move on to Lord Way or Nat now to talk about what next, where are we going with this? How can we be innovative with this? Where can we go with this agenda?
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, having myself not been directly in this space for many years, I was in Downing Street around sort of 2010, 11, and the whole move to sort of opening up government data. There's been so much progress, as you've heard. But I remember back in 2011 observing that if we don't get a move on to change government, not just how government uses technology, then and make many of the services more accessible and real time for people will get angry, and they'll vote for populists. And surprise, surprise, it happened. Because I observed that if you have in your hand so much power to govern so much in your life by buying something that's delivered to your door, which you can eat or use, and then sending it back, and yet you can't decide how often the bins are collected outside your house. If all these little things add up, and sadly, even some of the kind of things that we do to protect, from corruption and so on, and data collection, because it sweeps innocent people in as well, occasionally, that causes anger. I think, anybody who's recently been refused something in a bank account or some other, what used to be an annoyance every 1 or 2 years is sort of now for some every month, every 2 weeks. Something you are denying. The computer says no to you enough that you get angry. So I think, is it a surprise that our young people want to vote for dictators? Well, if the dictators can show they can cut through what seems to be lots of mini annoyances or this sense of not having power, and people who are, standing on a platform of taking back control or whatever language, they're tapping into something, which is that we didn't finish the job. And so I do think what next, first of all, is we need to go upstream, not just the way we execute current government functions in a more participatory way, but to change the way that people who design it, actually at the policy design, like before you even procure, you talk about, I've been going on for 3 or 4 years now, why can't we more rapidly roll out bidirectional electric vehicle charging so the cars can charge our houses at the peak? That's several nuclear power stations worth if we all did it, right? But somehow it hasn't happened. It's sort of like Winston Churchill was saying, we might need these tanks, in the Second World War that's coming. Can someone please stop feeding horses and get some tanks sort of sorted out? It's that kind of, but that's not an open procurement thing. This is like what are we going to buy that we're not buying now? What future procurement do we need to do to buy something that doesn't yet exist? Because we know there's a problem coming. And there's so many of these problems that we can see. I call them grey swans, slow motion car crashes, that you can see a few years ahead, that they don't sit within the risk register because they're not sort of a black swan, but they're not a white swan where you can deal with normal processes. You need something else. So that's the first thing I say. And then I think there's so many else I can say. But the second thing I think that is important is then the AI and especially agentic AI and some of the opportunities that are coming and the compute actually now allow us as citizens or people working in government, but as individual reformers within government, to start to model alternative ways of doing things. So before it was, here's how the system is done. Can we have a participatory process to sort of change the 1% or the 2%? Now it's, could we put the whole government department that's not working on GitHub? So would some of you like to put DWP on GitHub or the Home Office and reverse engineer all of their processes and then feed it into an agent model to see if we change this thing, would that make it better? Would we get our passports faster, or would we, get the benefit payment before someone runs out of food, for example? So that's not tinkering, that's not, I don't mean to say what we're doing is tinkering. It's really important at local authorities and so on that we engage citizens. But I like to engage the coders to kind of go, well, here's a department, it costs 100 billion to run a year. Could you, like the Estonians do, rewrite the whole thing and just focus on the worst bits of it, that don't work and that we can't, no matter how many outsourced, IT integrators we pay X billion to, we can't fix it. But I'm sure, 12 people in this room might be able to come up with a better way of running that entire government department. Legislation in the House of Lords, the House of Commons, I speak to the judges sometimes at the Old Bailey, some of the top, judges in the country, and they say maybe 30% of the laws that we create don't work. Like they're not practical. When I was there for lunch the other day, one of the judges said, I'm still waiting to sentence this criminal because the minister has taken power over the sentencing length of that criminal's jail term, and they haven't decided yet. So I have to keep the person in prison before I, make the judgment. So what if we saw all of our lawmaking as a sort of engineering process and worked out how to continuously improve the lawmaking? There is an AI sort of hobbyist group working with me to literally take all the real-time debates in Parliament and then mind map all of the possible changes to the laws that we're literally discussing now. And my dream one day is we could all bet on which ones will work or not. We could have a future policy prediction tool to say, great idea from a social entrepreneur or from a journalist or from an MP, what's the chance that it's going to work? And if we knew the probability of whether it will work or not, and the feedback people were giving, then we might not spend 100 billion on one that doesn't work. We might spend 10 billion on one that does work. And then the final point to say is I think we also then need to look at economics and incentives, because both in the market at large and in government there's culture, right? The way things are done. So if you heard my speech just now, I talked about if you say you're in government and you generate a benefit because you're using open source and innovation, should you not get some financial reward, not maybe to you personally, which would break the civil service sort of code, but a pot of money that Treasury says you can use that next year and the year after and the year after, which is huge, because in the civil service culture, you win by having more money and having more people and having more power, right? So why don't you give people power if they save us more money and make life better and more convenient? In the market, that might be, this is controversial, if a billionaire, and I don't mind if it's a billionaire, save the country 10 billion, should we give them, no taxes for 5 years? Because they saved us $1 billion.
What?
I know. Gen Z will be up in arms. But if you think about it logically, we're at the point where the tax rates have to go high in every country because we're in so much debt that we will be taxed a lot. And so ideas that reduce the costs to get more with the money that we have actually benefit us all.
Yeah, I am going to have to jump in because sadly we've run out of time. But anyone have a question? I would probably take one quick question. And then panelists, if you just want to, good time. I'll take. Oh, do you know? I know Ben, so I can't say yeah. I'll take Ben. There's a gentleman at the back.
Hello, I'm Chris Little. I'm a meteorologist, and we're very interested in public data and open data and responsibility of people who take the data. And one of the things that's kind of driven our science has always been the feedback loops. We put a lot of effort into validation and feedback to make sure that the system that we're using, whether it's AI or just solving Newton's laws of motion on a big computer, work. And what I see in a lot of innovation is no thought to the feedback. You know, it happens in the digital twins environment. There's no thought about feeding back and changing the product. I definitely see it in the AI community. You don't see where's the feedback loop and the corrective. It's all very well having an AI that will spot potholes in the road, but if you haven't got anybody with a shovel and some bitumen, it's not going to solve anything.
Just quickly on that, I mean, we have, through the National Action Plan process, we have it's you develop, co-create the plan, and then there's an ongoing process of oversight, so government and civil society ensuring that the plan is implemented as it should be. But it's not as, I think technology could help really improve the level of oversight, and I agree in terms of feedback loops more generally. Does any of the panel want, no?
I think that's a completely brilliant point. We used to have these magical things in this country, we still have a few of them, called What Works centres, which were like a complete sort of analogue way of trying to create that sort of feedback loop before we got into the territory where we had to have really expensive long-term public inquiries, which also have value, but not that immediate feedback loop. So a challenge, again, right back at this group of people. How can we create those feedback loops? What could that look like? How could we use tech to set that sort of thing up in real time?
Super quick on the procurement reforms. For the first time ever, the government's actually going to collect the patterns of competition. It's like, wow, so actually, did your procurement work to engage the market and SMEs? It's like, it doesn't sound revolutionary, but I was amazed the government wasn't collecting that information centrally before, which is staggering to me. So for the first time ever, we'll actually understand where you're engaging the market. That will be quite a strong feedback point.
Apologies, I know, I wish we had more time, but there's another group literally banging on the doors to get in. But can I please just ask you all to give a round of applause to our panel? And hopefully see some of you about. But yeah, thanks so much for coming.